So last time we were outside and I promised that I would deliver you guys an inside episode as well. So here we go. We'll talk about outside in the future episodes as well. We'll be probably putting some type of cork decking on. We'll see more about that. But today, inside insulation, which is the bigger part of aluminium boats. And I think, in my opinion, I don't think there is perfect option out there right now. And that's a bit problematic. Doing all the research and talking to folks, there are different variations, different options, but none of them is perfect. And I'll tell you, in my humble opinion, why I think so. So, some innovation would be lovely. Anyone out there with some good innovative ideas on new products that could help here would be more than welcome. And the topic, I would say, is 3-4 different problems that we need to solve with the insulation. But maybe first, let's take a step back. For the people who don't necessarily know that much about aluminium boats and the aluminium as a material, let's talk a little bit about why we need to insulate the boat in the first place. Number one, heat. Aluminium essentially conducts heat probably 500 times more than fiberglass, for example. So when the sun hits the aluminium, it heats up and it transfers all the heat through the aluminium inside the hull, makes everything super warm. So essentially, insulation is needed for protecting the hull and keeping it cooler. The second part, partly related to the thermal thing, is condensation. So how condensation happens? Let's take a practical example. So you have a Coke can, it's ice cold, you take it out of the fridge, you bring it outside to the sunlight, it starts sweating and dropping water all over the place. So essentially, when warm or humid air touches a colder aluminium, it starts sweating and dropping driplets, and in aluminium boat, standing water can cause corrosion. And the third one is noise. Aluminium, it's quite thin, especially in our boat, it's going to be 4mm aluminium. And when you're sailing, for example, and the water is slushing behind the hulls, or the waves are slumming the hull overall, or the dagger boards, which have kind of a hole in the hull as well, when the water gets in there, it obviously creates quite a lot of noise, and that can translate through the aluminium to the whole boat. So those three are the main things why aluminium boats in the first place need to be insulated, and of course different parts of the hull have different needs as well. So let's move on to the insulation in more detail. Sounds like a simple thing, you just insulate the whole boat and be done with it. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. Different parts of the boat are essentially exposed to different conditions, and I'll go through one by one each, and each of them might need a bit of special insulation consideration. And for our boat specifically, we are a performance aluminium catamaran, so the weight matters. If that wouldn't be a problem at all, this would be way easier of a thing, but insulating the boat can really be extra hundreds of kilos of weight, which we can't afford to have. So different parts of the boats are exposed. Some of the parts are exposed to full sunlight, some of them are just more exposed to cold, some of them are more exposed to different noises that could be coming to the boat. So there are various different things to consider. So rather than insulating everything equally, we're thinking about this in few different parts of the boat. Let's start from the saloon roof. Of course, on a catamaran, this is the largest part, which sits at the top of the hulls, and it's exposed to the most sunlight in the whole boat, pretty much. You can imagine the sunlight heating everything from above, and aluminium conducts the heat really well, and it really sinks into the saloon and makes it 40 degrees Celsius, for example. Even if it would be painted, for example, which I talked in the previous episode, it only reflects a bit of the sunlight away, so the saloon roof really needs good insulation to keep the boat cool. And even if you would have an air conditioning, if you don't have the insulation, the air conditioning just wastes energy if it starts cooling down, not just the air, but actual structural points as well. And in the saloon roof, this is more where the thermal insulation matters. Not that much of noise or anything, but thermal insulation matters the most. Saloon walls, so big windows, the aluminium frames in between them, is another thing that we need to think about. Even those aluminium frames that go from kind of outside to inside between the windows, they can conduct heat really excellently inside. So we need to think about how to insulate everything between those, and then we're of course thinking about double glazing the windows. We'll have proper glass windows, at least at the boat, so that creates a bit of better insulation. Double glazing might help, but then there might be some condensation and humidity between them and everything. So there's a lot of things to think about. And of course, each catamaran has two hulls. Those hulls have two different walls. The inside that more faces the sea and not really is exposed to that much to sunlight, and then we have the outer wall. So you can imagine our catamaran is 50 meters long, so 50 foot long, and that whole outer wall can spend hours and hours in direct sunlight every day, and our cabins where we want to sleep in are inside of those hulls. In addition to the heat, obviously these hulls are narrow, the water is slushing through them, slamming, so in addition to that thermal aspect, there's also the noise aspect. And most likely as well, we would have air conditioning, at least in our cabin, and that kind of creates the temperature differences between the aluminium there as well, which easily leads to condensation against the aluminium plates. So thermal insulation, acoustic insulation, and avoiding the water condensation and corroding the hulls is key things. So I think this is the biggest thing where we need to figure out the best insulation overall. Like I mentioned, the inner hull walls are not necessarily that big of a problem. Yes, from a noise perspective, acoustic perspective, we need to figure out some insulation, but it's not necessarily something that gets that much sunlight, so we don't need to worry about the heating aspect of it. Then, of course, we have the side decks that we talked about in the previous episode. We'll be likely putting cork or some cork blend 4 to 8 millimeters on top of the decks as well. That acts as a nice insulation as well. So we don't necessarily need to put a huge amount of thermal insulation inside the hull. Yes, definitely there will be some, but we'll discuss more of what that could potentially look like in our case. And then we have the bridge deck. So bridge deck can be considered kind of everything under the salon and in front of it before the netting at the front of the catamaran. And bridge decks, there's obviously a bit of heating things that we need to consider, thermal things that we need to consider, but I think the biggest thing is the noise. That's the part where you might have wave slamming and all sorts of things. Our bridge deck clearance is really high, 900 millimeters. So it's way more than the traditional lagoons and others have. So I'm not too worried about that big of a slamming, but if we're going upwind with the motor, yes, it's gonna slap and it's gonna translate the whole noise across the whole boat if we don't do at least some form of insulation potentially there. So there, the kind of acoustic noise insulation aspect is way more important than necessarily the thermal one, because underneath the boat there's not gonna be much heat coming in, as an example. So below the waterline, so essentially everything that's below the waterline, the bilges and so forth, typically you don't put any insulation there. Of course, we need to figure out ventilation and how to make sure that there's no water that gets standing there and whatnot, but this is not a part that you necessarily insulate in a boat. So to sum up, saloon roof needs thermal insulation, the outer hulls need noise, thermal and condensation water insulation, inner hulls mainly the acoustic side of things and a bit of air conditioning envelope, so to say. The deck above the hulls already gets some from the deck materials, so that's good, and a bit of something underneath it potentially as well. Bridge deck is more acoustic problem than anything else. And below the waterline, not necessarily insulation, but just other things to consider in the future episodes. The goal is really to put the right materials in the right places to keep the boat light, insulate it well, and make sure that things don't start corroding in the boat. Then moving on to the actual materials. The most common way in the past to insulate aluminium boats have been closed-celled foams. Those are made out of polyurethane, a mouthful to say for a non-English speaker. I don't know if I did that correct. And the sprayed foam is something that has a lot of different problems. It's a really light material. It takes care of quite well the problem of condensation, some acoustic insulation, and also the heat problem. So it's one of the, let's say, best materials from that perspective versus the compromises that some of the other materials have. but it doesn't come without issues, and the main ones are here. Number one, it's quite toxic stuff, meaning when you are putting it on, it's toxic at that stage. If it doesn't cure well enough, it can create toxic fumes, and it's really just generally toxic material, not sustainable at all. So that's one thing why you would want to get rid of it, definitely. The second thing is that it completely hides the aluminium hull as well. So if it doesn't stick to the aluminium really well and condensation starts happening, you can imagine what starts happening on the back of that foam. Second is future welding will be a pain with this one. Any foam around the welding areas, if you need to fix something, it can catch fire, it can create toxic fumes and everything, so you need to cut it off anyway. And yeah, there's big risks involved in that. Removal is horrible. You can imagine that it's almost like removing Sikaflex, not quite, but almost as bad. So removing it afterwards is a mess if you need to get access to something that's behind it. It's not also that great of an acoustic and noise protector in the hulls, so there are way better materials for that purpose. This is great for thermal purposes and it's super light, so those are really the pros, but the cons are that it's not as good acoustically as some other materials. And of course, if you think about the benefits of spraying anything, typically if you do it well, you can cover most of the parts really nicely. There's no caps to start creating condensation, or the heat would be conducted through those frames that are not covered properly. So spraying the foam, you can get quite a nice job done and cover most of the stuff from condensation and from the heat conducting perspective, as long as it's done really well. But like I mentioned, I would like to avoid foaming at all costs, and let's talk if it's actually realistic. So what could be an alternative? One alternative that many seem to be using is a product called Armaflex. It's an elastomeric foam that you cut into pieces, and basically you're using some adhesives to make it stuck to the aluminium. It provides less insulation. It's not as good as the foam in terms of the heat insulation. It's still pretty good and good enough, but not as good necessarily compared to the same amount and same weight of the foam. It's also a way heavier thing. This is probably one of the biggest problems for me. If I would put that all across the whole boat, we would be talking about hundreds of kilos of extra weight that we're putting onto the boat, and that becomes a little bit more problematic. One of the difficulties with the Armaflex and any type of paneling in the first place is that it's really labor intensive, and based on many real life examples, it seems to be hard to get it exactly right. Getting it around all the different framing, and when you have curved walls and whatnot, getting it really to stick to the aluminium so that there's no space for condensation, so that it actually glues 100%. It's obviously quite difficult. And it's not either, on the acoustic side of things, it's not the best one in that world. It's pretty good. Not as good as the foam even, and there's way better materials out there in the world as well. It's an excellent condensation and the vapor water type of insulation product, so that is something that it does really well, as long as it's installed well and as long as you don't have cabs in between of the frames and the panels. And of course, it's way easier to correct and repair. If you need to get access, you can get it easier off, or a bit less messy off than the foam, for example. And what other options are there? Cork is one option. So there's cork panels, but there's also sprayed cork that can be put on to the boat. It's really good for acoustic and noise insulation, because you can get it all over the framing and everything, and it damps the noise quite nicely. That's really good. For thermal, it's not that great. You would need a shit ton of it in order to get the same thermal insulation capabilities as something like the foam or Armaflex would provide you. So a little bit problematic. For the condensation issue, it's a really good product. Essentially, it creates a barrier and sticks directly into the aluminium, so there shouldn't be issues with condensation when you're using sprayed cork. The biggest problem with sprayed cork? The weight. What are then the good things about cork? What else is good about cork? It's a sustainable material, it's non-toxic, it doesn't really catch fire that easily. So 3 things that are quite important in my opinion in a space where you live it. And in addition to the weight, one problem is of course price. It's gonna be pricier than putting in foam, for example. And if we talk more about the weight in actual numbers, 50 millimeters of closed cell foam, which is the typical what you put on the walls of an aluminium boat, 3 millimeters of sprayed cork weighs the same amount. Obviously it doesn't provide the same thermal or acoustic insulation fully as that spray foam would do. So that's one of the biggest problems. You can't put too much cork if you're worried about weight, and we don't want to start adding 200 kilos just because we want a bit more. Cork has some benefits, some negatives. That's one option. So what else is out there? One is virgin basalt rock wool. A mouthful to say once again. Basically what that material is, it's essentially a mineral insulation that's made of volcanic basalt rock heated at extreme temperatures and made into different kind of fibers so that it's quite light and fluffy, so to say. The good thing about this stuff is it's super sustainable as well. Volcanic rock is everywhere and it doesn't really hurt, it recreates itself all the time. The second is that it's lighter than Armaflex, for example. If you add that, it's not that big of a problem. It has pretty good thermal and acoustic characteristics, so those are bonus as well. And it doesn't catch any fire at all, which is super good, of course, especially in an electric boat like ours. What are the problems with it? Basically, you need some vapor barrier between the aluminium and this stuff. And if this stuff gets really wet, it's been said that it doesn't really, it's breathable material, but if it gets super wet, it will take days and days and ages to dry out. So I'm not really sure if it's the best material to have exactly against the hulls. And once again, you will have the same problem as with Armaflex as well, that how do you put this stuff with the vapor barrier against the hull tight enough so that no condensation can happen in between. There are other materials as well, but I think these are the ones that I've kind of narrowed down that make sense. If there's any other ones that I've completely missed, that might be especially on the lighter side. Weight matters to me quite a lot. Just ping me and let's talk more. And there's also some science behind the thermal and acoustic noise side of things and how those are measured within these products and materials. And I'll put a table here so that you can kind of compare them side by side to get a better understanding of, okay, how good they are in thermal insulation, how good are they with acoustic and noise insulation, what's the weight of each product as well, and maybe a bit of pros and cons as well, listed nicely out here on the screen. So where am I actually leaning towards? Why I talked about all the different sections of a boat in the first place is that each section will be likely treated a bit differently. The base offer from our builder, for example, has only foaming on certain sections of the boat, and foaming is not needed definitely across the whole boat. One of the biggest thing is the weight aspect. So we need to really carefully think about where to put what and how much added weight it brings to the boat overall versus the benefit it actually brings. My, let's say, preference, if you think about the main places where we need to insulate the most. So let's take, for example, the outer hulls and the saloon roof. My thinking is that we could put a few millimeters of the sprayed cork. That makes it really good from an acoustic perspective. That creates a layer so that the condensation doesn't happen. But that is not necessarily the best thermal and fully acoustic insulation. So on top of that, I would want to consider the virgin basalt rock wool to put some amount of millimeters, probably let's say 30 to 50 millimeters of that on top of the cork. And that would be probably the ideal solution so that you have perfect condensation, insulation, the cork dams the noises quite a lot. You can put that nicely around the different frames, and when it's sprayed, you can make sure that it sticks to the walls perfectly. And we could put that across most of the boat. And then the basalt rock wool essentially would be the bigger thermal insulation, for example, in the saloon roof. So that would make sure that when the sun is heating up the saloon roof, that keeps the heat away. And of course it adds even more acoustic capability and noise insulation for the boat. So that's what I'm thinking for the main parts of the boat. And I don't want to put that everywhere because that increases the weight, because cork is pretty heavy and then this other stuff is heavy. So really we would be talking about a little bit more weight than just foaming those same areas. But I think the biggest consideration here is the weight. So let's talk first about the outer walls of the boat. So foaming those would obviously be a bit of some extra weight to the boat. So let's say it's going to be 60 kilos of extra weight foaming with 50 mil foam both of the outer hulls. If we would put that 3 mil layer of cork plus then the basalt rock wool on top of it, we would be probably adding roughly 60 kilos of extra weight just for the outside walls of the hulls. In inner walls, if we would do the same, this would be probably 30-40 kilos of extra. We might not need that thick of an insulation in the inner wall, so it could be a bit of less. Saloon roof, we're not talking about that much, but it's going to be maybe 20 kilos of extra, putting the 3 mil cork and the basalt wool there. And if we want to put anything on the bridge deck, we would probably put at least a 3 mil cork there to do a bit of insulation at least in some of those walls. It won't add hugely, it will add a couple maybe 20 kilos extra on the boat, so that's not the biggest things are really the hulls and a bit of the saloon roof. But overall we would be still talking about adding probably 100 kilos extra by doing this type of an insulation. So the weight is always consideration, but this type of an insulation would be sustainable, fireproof, would be probably pretty bulletproof as well, so it will be quite good of an option. And I'll need to think about and figure out like, hey, is that 3 mil cork needed? Could it be thinner layer as well? What type of sprayed cork options there are? I've been researching a few of them and talking to a few of them, but I think there might be still other even lighter options out there. And then for the basalt rock wool as well, is there even some other as sustainable and good options, or should we go with that one? And do we need to be 50 mil of that or maybe 30 mil of that? Need to calculate all of this in order to get a better understanding. If you guys, once again, if you have any better ideas than what I've been talking about right now, go for it. And weight matters for us, so keep that in mind for any of your proposals. If weight wouldn't matter, this would be a piece of cake, but weight matters a bit, so I'm open to any suggestions and ideas on how to best do this, or where should I not even put any insulation. So shoot me on the comments, but this is kind of where we are as of today, and more to come on the decisions. And as we speak and explore more of these options, I'll of course let you know what we end up choosing. But until the next time again.